Hi guys, we are discussing the Arthashastra and today we will go through the small gists of the non-Aryas in a Kautilyan state. Who are the non-Aryas? Non-Arya ascetics, outcasts, Patita, the fallen, Chandalas, Svapakas, Svaganin and Lubdhakas, Mlechas, jungle tribes, slaves and foreigners. We will get to what slaves really meant, and if you want to exactly understand what slaves meant in Kautilyan state, you can check out Abhijit Chavra's video on what slave meant in India. Slaves did not mean taking away prisoners of war in chains and selling them off in other lands as what is the word, inventitude or in servitude workers or something. I don't remember that word ever. So anyway, indentured workers or something. Non-Aryas, non-Arya ascetics. Vrishalas and Pashandas were both ascetics belonging to Sramana or non-Brahmanical sects. It is mentioned that Pashandas should live beyond the cremation grounds. However, from the reference to their quarters being searched periodically for suspicious characters, it seems that they could also live inside the city. They could stay in lodging houses in the city, but their stay had to be reported to the divisional officer. See how advanced the society was. In an emergency, their property could be seized. They were suspected but were also feared. The king was enjoined to listen to their complaints after those of gods and temples, but before those of Brahmins. Those who had no property could do penance instead of paying the fine when convicted of offences less serious than assault, theft, kidnapping, or adultery. Sakyas and Ajivikas, who are mentioned later, probably referred to Buddhist sects. Anyone feeding them during Brahmanical rites was fined a substantial amount. I wonder if Ajivikas were Buddhists, because Ashoka once killed 18,000 Ajivikas in a matter of 2 or 3 days in one expedition. Outcasts. The general term for all those forced to live outside the perimeter of a city or a village is Antavasain. I don't know how to pronounce it. Antavasain, it says. Translated here as outcasts, since the Arthashastra refers only to Varna and not to Jati, the caste in current usage. These could either be those cast out of the Arya fold or those who were never admitted to it. On the origins of the system up to 200 AD, Prabhati Mukherjee's Beyond the Four Varnas is highly recommended. We all need to read it. I think I'll read it too. Caste system up to 200 AD. Now, Patita, the fallen. Those who were cast out of the Arya fold for some heinous transgression of the code of conduct became the victims of social ostracism. Anyone cast out was relieved of the responsibility of maintaining his family, except his mother. Even his wife could abandon him. Neither an outcast nor his son could inherit family property. They were treated worse than idiots, lunatics, and lepers who could at least receive food from their families. Except in cases of defamation and assault, they could be called as witnesses only in cases involving their own group. It is not clear from the text whether they formed an endogamic group of their own or merged with some other group beyond the pale. Now, Chandalas. Among the non-Aryas, the most frequently mentioned are the Chandalas. In view of the heavy fine of 100 pan, it's called panas, but from the Chanakya series that I saw by Chandraprakash Dwivedi, which is available on YouTube, which he made for Doordarshan in the early 1990s, there I understood that the pronunciation is pan. In view of the heavy fine of 100 pan imposed on a Chandala for touching an Arya woman, this group was clearly the untouchables. This is further borne out by the reference to Chandalas and other impure persons, quote-unquote, the well of the Chandalas of use only to Chandalas. This is what Chanakya himself says. And their being made to live beyond the cremation grounds also proves that point. As people who are not permitted to live in settled areas, they were employed by the state as guards for the safety of the land between villages. The reference to just as a Chandala stands to, this is a quote from Chanakya, which he is referring to, the translator. The reference to the quote, just as a Chandala stands to benefit when a wild dog fights a wild boar, indicates that they could have eaten meat prohibited to others. This quote actually will come back later as well. The quote is that just as a chandala stands to benefit when a wild dog fights a wild boar, it's a metaphor for when a war happens, someone else does benefit. So when a wild dog and wild boar fight, the beneficiary is the chandala because he gets to eat both their meat. While the fine on chandalas for theft of small animals was half that for others. See, this is why we should be proud of our culture, because there are flaws. Every society has flaws, but even in the flaw, there is some sense of practicality and empathy. Chandalas, since they are so ostracized, they can't have a proper job and go to a restaurant and buy food, obviously. So their fines for theft of small animals was half of what it was for others. It's not like they couldn't eat anything. For stealing, their punishment was half. So they could eat legally, but if they did resort to stealing, they would be punished less than others. The punishment for them for defamation or assault was the highest. They were also classified as a separate group for the purposes of the law of evidence. They seem to have been used to impose punishment thought to be particularly degrading. A woman convicted of misconduct was whipped publicly by a chandala. The body of a suicide was dragged through the streets by a chandala. Now we come to something called svapakas. I don't know what the word is today anymore. Svapakas. Like chandalas, svapakas or dog breeders were also a group at the lowest levels of society. For example, an Arya man having relations with a svapaka woman was branded and exiled, while a svapaka man having relations with an Arya woman was put to death. Now we come to svaganin and lubdhakas. Svaganin is spelled as Svaganin. These are translated here following Kangal. Kangal was the previous translator, as hunters and fowlers. The hunter's name indicates that he hunted with dogs. For example, a quote from Chanakya says, "Just as the cow of a hunter is milked for his hounds and not for Brahmins." This quote explains this fact. The two groups are often referred to together as being employed as guards between settlements, for catching robbers in forests, for clearing thieves, wild animals and enemies from pastures, and the kings hunting forests, and for guarding the military base camp. The references in the Arthashastra are purely professional and do not indicate their social status as separate and endogamic groups. Sabara and Pulinda are two other communities mentioned as guarding the area between the frontier and the settled regions. Now we come to Mlechas. As a group, they could have been of foreign or tribal origin, since they and jungle tribes are often mentioned together, particularly as fighting forces. Mlechas were employed as spies and suitably disguised to poison the enemy. A Mlecha could sell or mortgage his children. After conquering a territory, the king is advised to transfer and disperse Mlechas living there. Now, jungle tribes. Jungle tribes, each with its own chieftain, were feared but were also used as fighting forces. Disagreeing with other unnamed teachers who thought that highway robbers were more dangerous than jungle tribes, Kautilya says, now it's a direct quote from Kautilya himself, "Unsubdued jungle tribes live in their own territory, are more numerous, brave, fight in daylight, and with their ability to seize and destroy countries, behave like kings." This is what he's saying about jungle tribes. Tribal forces are specifically mentioned as one of the 6 types of troops, with the comment that they were unreliable and were interested only in plunder. As troops, they were useful in showing the way, putting down a small enemy incursion, or when their special skills made them valuable. Theft by them of small animals was treated more leniently. On the whole, tribal chieftains seem to have been independent of the king so long as they did not harass the country and came to the king's help when called upon to do so. On slaves. All slaves were non-Aryas. The regulations regarding slaves and bonded labor, including their rights, we will get to in future videos. Foreigners. Depending on the context, different terms are used for foreigners. The regulations for the city include one which requires that outsiders or bahirikas who may cause harm to the city were not to be let in. If at all they were, they had to pay a tax. The tax called, wait, this is a tough word, Dvara Bahirika, outsider toll. The tax called Dvara Bahirika or outsider toll was important enough to merit a special mention in the revenue for the city. On keeping a watch over strangers in drinking halls, we used to have drinking halls 2300 years ago, the word used is visitor or agantu. Foreign artists who had to pay a special tax of 5 pund per show are also called visiting artists or agantuka. These terms may refer to strangers to the locality rather than true foreigners. Yes, because actual foreigners were called mlechas. Like Sandeep Sanyal repeatedly says, people of Southeast Asia even were not called mlechas. The three references on ports and ferries are to foreigners in the sense of visitors from another country. Foreign merchants could enter the country only if they were frequent visitors or were vouched for by local merchants. The ferryman at the crossing point was responsible for collecting the import duty, escort charges and road cess, CESS. Foreign seagoing vessels had to pay duty or port dues if they entered territorial waters.